All right, hi. So first off, before we start, I just wanted to thank those of you that managed to attend our most recent online interaction. And I think we used Google Hangouts Meet, right? Thanks a lot. At its peak, I think the interaction had a total of about 31 people or something, which is roughly about 33% of the class. So I thought that was really good. Certainly an improvement from the previous interaction which we had, where we had about just 8 individuals. But that's fine. Okay, so I thought we'd continue off from where we left off. And before we start, I'm just going to switch off my webcam here, just because I guess it's going to be a distraction. Okay, great. But before we continue for our discussion of software process models, I just thought I'd mention a few things here. There was a question that came from one of you people the last time we had a formal lecture session, and I think it was to do with our discussion of integration and configuration, right? So this whole notion of reusing already existing software components that you download online, right? So-called software libraries or components, modules, doesn't matter really. Right. So I just thought I'd first of all start off by reminding us of our discussion to do with copyright and licensing, and I think I just wanted to start by emphasizing the fact that there's a fundamental difference between a license and copyright, right? A license essentially spells out what you are allowed to do when you download a particular software component or module. So in this case, Passport. The Passport license, which is the MIT license, will highlight what I'm allowed to do when I reuse that particular component. The copyright, on the other hand, specifies the individual or the entity that holds the copyright of that particular component, right? So in this case, it's this individual called Judd Henson, right? I hope that's clear. So something else that you want to pay particular attention to as you're downloading and reusing these software components is the details associated with the license, especially if you don't have experience with most of these licenses. For the most part, what you probably end up seeing is that the vast majority of these components that you find online are normally associated with BSD or MIT license, right? So once you read the fine print associated with the particular license, which is MIT license, in this case, you should be fine. But just wanted to emphasize that, or to highlight the fact that it's important that you read the details associated with the license, right? So in this case, the MIT license spells out exactly what I'm allowed to do with the license. Remember that there are certain licenses, especially those associated with Creative Commons, that will sometimes only allow you to use that piece of software if you're not going to have commercial versions of derived software, right? So just something to keep at the back of our minds here. All right, so before we continue our discussion of process activities, I just wanted to also make mention of the fact that the slides have changed slightly. In particular, we've incorporated slides that highlight a particular section of the lecture series that we'll be discussing, just because, we just want to make this transition to this online mode of instruction slightly more bearable, right? So I'm just going to quickly transition to the process activity discussion. And a reminder that we stopped off our chat, I think, when we were talking about integration and configuration, and briefly started process activities. But I just thought I'd give us an example of usage of this whole notion of integration and configuration software model, right? Just to emphasize or to underscore the importance of this particular technique. And one of the reasons why I think it's important is because the vast majority of us are eventually going to end up using this particular software process model, right? So we had a discussion of libraries and where would potentially find these reusable components, or places like GitHub, or Node Package Manager, or NPM, for those of you that are going to find yourselves using JavaScript, CTAN, if you find yourself using Perl, for instance, right? And we had a lengthy chat about web services and how we get to access them by taking advantage of so-called APIs, or application programming interfaces, right? And then we had a lengthy discussion on some of the pros and cons, and the examples, or some of the examples I'm going to walk you through, or the illustrations I'm going to walk you through, are going to mostly focus on the disadvantages. Briefly highlight the advantages as well, though. Okay, so I thought I would use an easy to understand example, and it's something that's closer to home. My blog, which you can access by going to this URL here, is implemented using a content management system called WordPress, right? But a rather interesting thing about the blog, and WordPress in particular, is the fact that it's implemented using so-called plugin architecture. What's interesting about this is it makes it a lot easier for people to extend the functionality of the CMS, right? This makes sense because for the most part, you have people with varying backgrounds that end up using WordPress, right? So you could be a person like Lighton wanting to set up a personal blog, for instance, download WordPress, you use it. It could be a relatively small institution wanting to implement your website using WordPress. You just download WordPress and you use it. And you notice that because there's potentially different people working in different domains that will end up using WordPress, and it has to be generic in nature. And the only way that you can configure WordPress or extend it so that it suits your need or your domain is by making use of or taking advantage of its plugin architecture. So you download plugins, WordPress plugins, and then you integrate them with implemented web platform or website, as they call it. And so my blog in particular has a number of plugins. So these are essentially just small reusable components. Each blog post, when you visit lighten.org, each blog post has a vertical strip on the left corner of the screen that essentially shows you some really interesting metrics. Now, these metrics for now are mostly associated with Twitter and Facebook. So there'll be numbers that you see associated with these buttons, like this tweet here. The three essentially signals the fact that 3 people tweeted this particular blog post that we're looking at. The 57.3 thousand means that I had no idea that 57.3 thousand shares. It essentially means that this particular blog post was shared 57.3 thousand times. I'm not sure if there's a glitch here. I'll probably need to look into this. Okay, but there's more, right? There's other components there. On the right hand side of the screen, you typically find a tweet stream which shows the 2 most recent tweets that I've tweeted out on my personal Twitter account, right? It's important for me because it provides people that are subscribed to information on my blog access to the things that I do on these other platforms, external platforms, in this case Twitter, right? But it gets even better, right? There's a Who is Online strip, which essentially provides you with details of geographic locations of people that have recently visited my blog, right? A key thing to note here is that all these different components or plugins I was talking about are possible because they were implemented in such a way that they interface with external services. So for instance, for the number of tweets to be made available on this vertical strip here, the plugin makes use of the Twitter API, right? And there's really nothing complex about interacting with the Twitter API. But that's besides the point. Our discussion is not really to look at how exactly you go about interacting with the Twitter API. The idea was just to highlight examples of where integration and configuration is useful, becomes useful. Okay, but like we mentioned before, there are certain downsides associated with integration and configuration, and it so happens that my blog has actually, or I've actually experienced this as I create blog posts on my blog, create articles and blog posts on my blog. So a classic example of what happened to me recently is, and I'm using a blog post that previously made use of information that was generated using a Google service that has since been discontinued. It's called, or at least it used to be called Google Fusion Tables, right? And because it was discontinued, I can no longer interact with that API, which is why all the blog posts that made use of information coming through from Google Fusion Tables have this this error message here, which is highlighted in red. Right, so all this is tied to this notion of not having control over the evolution of these components that you're wanting to reuse, right? You're at the mercy of the people that implemented these components, or the people that have come up with these APIs, right? Just to emphasize the notion of loss of control here, if Twitter or Facebook suddenly decided to say they no longer wanted to make available their API, then we would no longer have access to these metrics here, right? We'll have to find a workaround to ensure that this information persists. Right? I hope that makes sense, right? Again, just to to emphasize or underscore the notion of Google Fusion Tables. So it's a really useful service that was around for well over a decade. Actually, it was formerly discontinued, I think, on March 3rd, 2020, right? And they did a really good job in providing details on how you'd go about migrating pre-existing data to, I guess, an alternative solution. Alas, though, I've been quite busy and haven't really had time, or I didn't have time to migrate data that was previously generated using Google Fusion Tables and Google Fusion Table. And when I actually did have or find the time, it was already too late because it was way past the March 3rd, 2020 deadline. So my data is gone. It's deleted, right? So these are all, I guess, disadvantages associated with this whole notion of reusing already existing components and web services. I hope that makes sense. Okay, and so just to recap on what we actually discussed in the section associated with software process models, we had a broad overview of why these software process models are important, and then we had a lengthy discussion on three main types of software models, or three types of software process models. Specifically, we looked at the waterfall, otherwise called the traditional model, which really is unique in that each of the different phases associated with this model have to be performed in sequence. And so for you to perform activity number 2, you must ensure that activity number 1, activity that precedes it, is executed, right? We looked at disadvantages and advantages of that particular model, and more importantly, we looked at some unique use cases that take advantage of the waterfall model. We looked at incremental development, where we discussed this notion of developing software in iterations, essentially to cut down on potential errors associated with the software. We highlighted the fact that these days it's probably one of the most widely used software process models, and also made mention of the fact that we have a lengthy discussion of agile methods, and we're going to specifically focus on Scrum, right? And then finally, we had a discussion of integration and configuration. Okay, thanks a lot. In the next section, we going to really dive into the software process activities to try and understand the different activities that are associated with software development processes or life cycles, usually. Thank you.